I would like to talk briefly about four things in this lecture tonight. First, I'd like to talk just briefly about the situation that we face today, some of the parameters of that. Secondly, I'd like to talk just briefly about the dynamics of transformation as they relate to the question of why one would want to study any archetypal patterns of gender and sexuality. Because sometimes it's not so obvious to a lot of people why we Jungians want to study gods and goddesses, for example. They think we have a strange antiquarian interest. And I'd like to say a little bit about the context in terms of analysis and therapy and healing for why we want to look at these archetypal patterns and images in the context of healing, either the feminine or the masculine. Then I'd like briefly to talk with you about some of my reflections and research on four archetypal patterns of the masculine which we can discern in cross-cultural studies. The king, the warrior, the magus, and the lover. Those are by no means exhaustive of archetypes of the masculine, and we'll talk some about that and discuss some about that later, but those are the four that I will touch on both tonight and in the workshop. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about accessing these archetypal potentials, some of the ways we have all accessed them. I'll talk a little bit about confronting and dealing with the dark side of these archetypal patterns, and talk a little bit about the problem of that I call the imperialism of the archetype in the context of individuation, and how we can work with that with regard to these archetypes of the masculine. And so, with no further delay, let me jump in and follow along as best you can, and then you can expand it in our discussion. First, let me talk a little bit about our contemporary situation. As John pointed out, there is an increasing awareness among cultural interpreters from various disciplines that there is a crisis in masculinity today. And there's increasing consciousness about some of the dimensions of that crisis and some of the ways in which that crisis illuminates some of the work and recent discussions by radical feminists in their critiques of patriarchy. And again, we will be talking a little bit about this whole issue of patriarchy tonight. Quite simply, and in a context that is familiar to you as Jungians, the crisis is a crisis in modern culture of masculine initiation. That is, if you want to understand the reason for so much gender and sexual identity confusion in our cultural context today in modern industrial culture, you can't simply point to the media or to some simplistic explication of family patterns and so forth. You have to look at the decline of ritual process in modern culture. The fortunes of ritual process are directly tied to the psychotropic technology which leads to the formation of men and women. In pre-modern cultures, it was the norm that you had a developed ritual process for formation of gender identity, sexual identity, in relationship to the norms and visions and values of the tribal culture in which these rituals were celebrated. We don't have time tonight to do a cultural and intellectual history of the decline of ritual process, but it takes no great scholar to trace the impact of the Reformation and the fortunes of ritual in the culture of the Enlightenment of the 18th century as being the development which ultimately led to the discrediting of ritual in so-called civilized human culture. And once you discredit ritual, and you tend to shove it over and make it into what Victor Turner calls mere ceremonial, then you have already done away with the processes which are needed in a culture to help form both feminine and masculine identities. And so we need to be clear that the crisis that we have in this topic, this area, is not isolated from problems we have widely in our culture which are related to the decline, the eclipse, we might say, of ritual process. Now, many of you are aware that there is a rebirth in interest in ritual and much creative experimentation being done now on this topic, and that's a hopeful sign. But this is a very important part of the contemporary crisis. Now, what happens if masculine initiation stops being something that a society takes seriously? Well, quite simply, you get a lot of men who either had no masculine initiation or who had only what you might call a pseudo-initiation. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. But the marks of an uninitiated male are usually two types of phenomena that we see a lot in the clinician's consulting room. And that is, one, either the male is very violent and abusive, or he's very passive and weak, or he oscillates between the two. We will see some of the reasons for this kind of thing later. But for those people that have studied this sort of thing, it is quite clear that you might call that marks of the immature masculine as they manifest themselves, certainly in relationships. Now, increasing consciousness about problems with the masculine, of course, has been brought about by a lot of feminist reflection. Very helpful feminist reflection, which has been a critique of what some have called machismo, and certainly, as John Giannini mentioned, the attack on the nature, the dynamics, and the structures of patriarchy, in which patriarchy is seen as an expression of masculinity's attempt to dominate, have abusive power over the feminine in all of its cultural and personal expressions. Quite simply, many have concluded that masculinity is, in its roots, essentially abusive, and that the capacity for eros and gentleness and so forth comes from embracing the feminine side. We Jungians have talked a great deal about that in recent decades. But there has been a tendency in this recent analysis and discussion of failures in masculinity to equate patriarchy and masculinity. Now, one of the theses which I do want to affirm tonight is that you cannot simply equate masculinity and patriarchy. In fact, in my view, the structures of patriarchy are an expression of an immature manifestation of the masculine. And we will see more about that shortly. So one assumption that I have is that patriarchy does not result from too much development of masculine power. My essential argument on this topic is that patriarchy, the patriarchy that we have come to understand more clearly in recent years, is in fact an expression of a stunted masculine. A masculine that feels itself to be impotent in relation not only to the feminine, but to other men. We will see in a little bit about the way in which an uninitiated male may seek to dominate women. They also seek to dominate other men because essentially they fear them. Fear not only the feminine, they also fear the masculine. So another kind of implication of this that I affirm when I'm speaking on this topic is that contrary to some people's assumptions, that the answer to our current cultural problems with masculine and feminine relationships is to somehow reduce masculine power. My point of view is exactly the opposite, that masculine abuse of power has resulted from the fact that young men and boys have not been helped to develop such a sense of calmness and acceptance of their masculine powers that they do not have to be constantly engaging in what I call impressive behavior. The assumption being if you have to engage in impressive behavior all the time, you're actually operating out of anxiety, not out of confidence. So the problem, as I see it, that we face is not too much masculinity, but too much wounding of the masculine, so that the masculine, and I think this could be said also of the masculine in women, that the masculine fixates at immature levels of development, at which this immature masculine fears and hates both the masculine and the feminine and abuses whatever power it can gain over others. From my point of view, and the point of view that I try to illuminate in these workshops and so forth, is that we must learn to love and be loved by the masculine in ourselves and others. To stop slandering the masculine, stop wounding it, and start celebrating its strength, its power, and its potency. That our task today in the midst of this crisis is really not to find ways to reduce the potency and power of men, but to help them gain such a feeling of confidence in their identity as men that they can use the power that they have stewardship over to empower others, both men and women. We'll be talking a lot in these moments together about stewardship of power and the use of power to empower, which is a mark of maturity. If you don't have a healed and empowered masculine, then you will not have a masculine, you will not have a man who can take his place in a mature, sacred marriage, hieros gamos, or its expression in a relationship here in history, not just in the archetypal realm. We have a situation in which men have even lost their contact with the foundations of masculinity that existed in tribal cultures. So our problem now is, how can we put men back in touch with the deep masculine? You know, feminists were talking a long time about the importance of the descent to the goddess. And we men are sometimes a little slow And it takes us a while to become aware that, we have our own descent to make. And it took Robert Bly to come along and try to get us to find Iron Hans and to try to go on our own search for the deep masculine through fairy tale and story, etc. But I take it that our job is much more complicated even than Bly has seen, and it comes in this context of finding our own way in our own reflection to the structures of the deep masculine. And we Jungians talk about that in terms of archetypal structures. Let me turn now to speaking briefly about archetypes and the dynamics of transformation. The context that I suggest that you think about this in is in the context of healing ritual in general. And the best work to give one a field for that is, of course, the work of Mircea Eliade. And looking at Eliade's discussions of the importance of sacred space for all regeneration in human culture. When Eliade speaks of the importance of locating a sacred space and enabling a primitive person to connect with the numinous, or the sacred, in order that the world might be regenerated, he's talking about the same type of thing that we Jungians speak of when we talk about connecting with the archetypal realm, or developing what we know as an ego-self axis. In this context tonight, we might put it in this way. If one has been terribly wounded in one's femininity or in one's masculinity, and one is seeking healing, then one needs to find a vessel in which the powerful, regenerating structures of the numinous masculine or numinous feminine can become experienced, felt as a presence, and then enable one to heal, become more whole, reintegrate, become more empowered. And so we might say, to expand the phrase a little bit, not only do we need an ego-self axis, what we need, and what clearly many are saying today, is that we need to facilitate the development of a creative an axis between the ego of individuals and specific archetypal potentials which they need in their own development at this particular time in their individuation process. So, when we speak of archetypal images, when a Jungian like Jean Boleyn studies goddesses and writes about Aphrodite, say, it's not merely an academic enterprise, it is an enterprise presenting an image which has potency for healing of a person who is out of contact with that archetypal potential imaged by that particular goddess. And so the same thing is true in this context that we are talking about tonight. In other words, from my point of view, I do not choose to talk about kings because kings are interesting and people seem to be fascinated by them. I choose rather to do that because for some time Jungians have known that the sacred king is a powerful archetype of the masculine. And let me begin now to talk about these four archetypal potentials and why it is important to access in an appropriate way each of these. You all are probably familiar with the work of John Perry, whose work with psychotics and research at the Centre Diabasis was so pioneering and issued in so many interesting books on myth and psychosis. one particularly important one, the roots of renewal in myth and madness. You may remember in John Perry's work that he discovered that in the midst of a deep transformation process, you usually got imagery of a world that looked very much like the primitive world of ancient kingship. You got a quadrated universe with a center, and often a royal personage at the center of this world. Now, John Perry was fascinated by this, and it led him into research on sacred kingship. And that research issued in a book entitled Lord of the Four Quarters, Myths of the Royal Father. And as a resource for our topic tonight, I recommend that you get that book. You'll probably have to get it out of a library because it's, I think, out of print now. But at any rate, he was pointing out the power of this archetype in the human psyche. In his work, he saw it as an expression of this change process that he saw in psychotic process and the healing process with psychotics and schizophrenics. He noted that in ancient kingship, the king served two primary functions. One, that the king served as the center of the world. The king was the human representation of what Eliade calls the axis mundi, the center of the whole universe. And that the person of the king actually provided order. And that if the king was following the divine law that the king had been given, the universe and the kingdom would be in a right order. The king would not have to use coercive force to have peace. You recognize the relationship between this and a lot of the mythology of the rainmaker and other concepts of putting oneself in the Tao and having the external world become right somehow. And this is related to Indian concepts of right order in society, as well as the Chinese concept of the Tao. So that's one of the important things. The king as center, bringing peace by virtue of his role as providing the dynamic center of the world, of the universe. The second function was that the king was, by his very nature, a fertility figure. A figure who represented by his very being fertility and creativity. And it was incumbent upon the king to see to it that the realm flourished. And so in some ways, John spoke of this book on the phallus. In some ways, the king was viewed as a divine phallus, a source of potency and power and fertility and creativity for the entire realm. Now, Perry's work focused on the role of this centeredness image for the psychotic and the image of creativity and renewal for the renewal process in psychosis. What I want to suggest to you is that we need to take that a little further and understand the way in which, in the masculine psyche, the image of the king represents, in the same way that Perry pointed out, the potential of centeredness and calmness and creativity in the masculine psyche. You can put it this way. If a man is not in some deep way accessing this archetypal potential within himself, he will not be calm, he will not be centered, and he will very probably not feel himself to be very creative. And if I had time, I would go into a lot of the different examples of that, and I will do that in the workshop. So the principles, the potentials involved in this particular archetypal structure relate to the role of the axis mundi in the ancient world. The throne is at the center of the universe. If there is no one there, the universe is disordered. There is chaos, and if there is some disorder with this archetypal aspect, there is blight upon the land. We see this in the mythology of the wounded king, the wounded Grail king, or the wounded fisher king. We see this in the mythology of the old king who will not get out of the way. There's something wrong with the king. The king has got to die for the world to be renewed. In the ancient world, there is a lot of ritual around the ritual killing of kings. Periodically, you had to kill the king to renew the realm. You've all heard the king is dead, long live the king. It's in this context of ritual of fertility and renewal that actual practice occurred. And you can see something of the emergence of that archetypal structure in Christianity. In the death and resurrection motif in Christianity, you see the same kind of archetypal structure manifesting itself there. Let me turn now to the warrior. I often think that I ought to lecture on the fool archetype, because anybody that would say anything good about the warrior where I teach has got to be a fool. You have to know about Chicago Theological Seminary. It's a big peace school, you know. But I try to take a consistent Jungian point of view about archetypes. If something's an archetype, as Nathan Swartz said last weekend, something's an archetype, it's not going to be banished, it's not going to be done away with, it's either going to be expressed positively or negatively. And so, let's look a little bit at the archetype of the warrior. I get asked a lot, why so many Rambo dolls are sold? I try to sidestep that question. The warrior is an image of the human potential for a number of things. One, strange as it may sound initially, the capacity for a radical commitment to transpersonal loyalty and service. A radical commitment to transpersonal loyalty and service. It represents, when it is fully expressed, it represents a capacity for enormous discipline, self-abnegation, enormous courage in facing odds which seem insurmountable. It represents a clarity of thinking in a certain field of endeavor. It represents the capacity to stand a great deal of discomfort and pain in the service of one's goal. It represents the capacity to radically relativize relational commitments in the service of one's higher loyalties, what are perceived to be higher loyalties at the time. Interestingly enough, it is this kind of archetypal structure that is so heavily constellated in the lives of outstanding creative artists. We can talk a little bit about the shadow sides of these things in a minute. You all know the shadow sides of this archetypal structure, my lie. And if you've been to see Platoon, I usually, when I'm having students study this stuff, I send them to movies a lot. If you've been to Platoon, you see the two sides of this, the two poles of this archetype expressed in the two sergeants in Platoon. Human beings are prone, the less developed they are, to literalize more and act out archetypal structures. The human propensity to act out warfare and to concretize this particular potential has made us a little bit, has made it extremely difficult for us to think about this archetypal potential. But if you have noticed what happens in a person who does not access this thing, then you can see apparently what the instinctual sort of agenda for this is. If a person has none of this, they will not be able to focus. Think about yourself if you're a graduate student. If you have no warrior, if you have no access to your warrior, you won't be able to focus. You won't be able to do the unpleasant things that are always involved in study, in the graduate program, etc. You will not be able to take careful stock of the situation that you face. You will not be able to isolate what you should, in fact, deal with. And you will not be able to muster your resources and address the issue consistently and steadily and with courage. This will be the case in all areas of your life. If some of you here, happen to know some of you here are working on books, writing books. If you ever tried to write a book and you're not in accessing the warrior archetype, you'll never write it because it's too painful to write a book. And if you're not really accessing this particular archetypal potential, you'll never stand the pain long enough to realize what it is that you're trying to work on. Let me turn now to the magus. Some call this the magician. The magus, the archetype of the magus, is an archetype which has not received very much careful reflection, interestingly enough. We Jungians tend to be aware of it mostly in its pathological forms, in which we speak of the monopersonality, or someone who is inflated with this particular archetypal content. Of course, the popular image that we all know about and speak of, has been written about so much lately, is Merlin. So what we're talking about is the inner Merlin here. It's the most introverted in terms of expression of all of these archetypal potentials. I always call this the archetype of awareness and insight. It is not, when one studies this archetype, and the way I studied this initially was in field studies of the occult. Some 10 years ago, I began to do field studies with occultists all across the United States, interviewing practicing magicians, not stage magicians, ritual magicians. I had become interested in magic and the occult because of things I was encountering in my practice at that time. I began to realize that there was more to this pattern than I had understood, and so I spent a lot of time observing both masculine and feminine forms of this particular archetypal structure. When you get into it, it is not nearly as mystifying as it appears from the outside. The best way to think about what a magus is a parallel to a master electrician. Or today it might be more accurate to say it parallels someone who is a very competent nuclear technician operating in one of the nuclear plants. That is to say, this image is an image of a very cool, analytical, mind which seeks to understand dynamic processes as they appear impersonally in people. What you and I would call, for example, psychodynamics. Magicians understand energy and energy flow patterns, the relationships between them. Magicians seek to understand what you can do and what you can't do without getting hurt. You remember the little thing in Fantasia about the sorcerer's apprentice? The difference between the sorcerer and the sorcerer's apprentice is that the sorcerer's apprentice only knows to push the on buttons. They don't really know much about what is actually going on and what is likely to happen, and they certainly do not know how to push the off buttons. There are a lot of psychotherapists like that. Whoever turned you on forgot to turn you off was a country song I used to love.
I think it's the same thing. I'm sure.
Thought I'd get that in for you, John.
Yes.
But you don't want a magician that operates that way. Traditionally, in traditional cultures, magicians thought themselves to be dealing with celestial hierarchies and celestial power forces, but the principles were very much the same. They were clearly dealing with forces which could be dangerous, could be very creative, very useful, but dangerous to someone who did not understand the forces. The trappings of the magician were not to impress the magician. The magician knew that it was trappings. The trappings of the magician were to help them in channeling the forces, insulate people and themselves from the destructive aspects of the forces, and to help them to understand how to predict what may happen in a given situation and what might be done in order to change the direction of energy flows, etc. Now, one goes into therapy or analysis when one feels that one's own inner magus is not functioning too well, that things are happening in the energy flow patterns of my life that I do not understand, and I'm getting burned here and there. I'm getting shocked here and there by conjunctions of things which I do not understand. And so, to put it sort of simply but accurately, what we do when we go into therapy, and not just Jungian therapy, is we project the archetype of the magus onto a therapist who we hope is a journeyman, see, and has done the homework that we can learn from until our own inner magus has the insights that we need to operate this thing. So it's not all that mystifying or mystical or spooky when you get into it. It is actually has a lot to do with useful technical knowledge. And clearly today, that is the ruling archetype of all psychotherapeutic practice. In my view, a psychotherapist that's not aware of the importance of this archetype for them is probably living it out. Without the constellation of this archetype, the capacity for valuing, appreciating in a subtle and nuanced mode is radically curtailed. Think about this as I talk a little bit about some expressions of the archetypal lover. Think first about the evangelical representations of Jesus. All of these hymns, these traditional old evangelical hymns that embarrass mainline, straight, uptight religionists today, are expressions of Jesus as the archetypal lover. Many people, and if I had time, we'll probably do some of this tomorrow, but I'd ask you to quote me some lines from some of these hymns. Many people have pointed out how sexual they are. and how these old hymns really are clearly are erotic. Well, the point of view that we should have here, and that we'll talk further about tomorrow, is that certainly they are erotic. Jesus in the Gospels is clearly manifested as the archetypal lover in many dimensions of that pattern. Not all, I might add. But notice the thing about Jesus as he's presented in the Gospels. He can appreciate things nobody else will. He can appreciate people that nobody else would appreciate at all. And in fact, if you wanted to characterize the power of the Christian revelation, it might be useful to reflect upon it in the context of this archetypal structure. People are so wounded in their lover that when they get anywhere close to a manifestation of the archetypal lover, they begin to home in on it. They begin to be very responsive to it. Let me take another tradition briefly, the Hindu tradition. It's no accident that there is so much erotic excitement in a certain wing of Hinduism in response to the images of Krishna. Because Krishna is a great lover, an expression of the archetypal lover. On my living room wall, I have a painting of Krishna and the gopis, which is a representation of Krishna loving each gopi equally. Of course, the gopi doesn't know that they're not the only one. I'm saying. But Krishna loving each one in the individual beauty of each cowmaid, right? So the capacity for delight, the capacity for focus on individual differences, the capacity to empathize, to make erotic connections, to take great delight in every realm of life is grounded in this particular structure. Tomorrow we'll get a lot more into that, but let me point out now some of the relationships between these and their shadow sides. You all are aware of the shadow side of the king. It's the tyrant. The image of Caligula, image perhaps for some of Saul, certainly the image of Herod. The shadow king is a king who uses the power to oppress, not to empower. You might say that the shadow king is the chief expression in the culture of patriarchy. The shadow warrior, of course, is the warrior who lacks the capacity to value enough to know when he is committing atrocities. In platoon, the soldiers are represented as having a vague sense that something is wrong when they're raping the little girls. Vague sense that something is wrong. And if the warrior archetype would go into a lot of the different ways in which it's pathologized in different personality types and in various personality disorders, I do a lot more with the clinical materials tomorrow. But one of the things that this archetype will do when it is possessing an individual rather than the person's being out of touch with it, is it will break their personal relationships. You cannot, if a person is too much dominated by the warrior archetype, most, for example, compulsive personalities are, then their relationships are at great risk. You don't really have a personal relationship with somebody that's dominated by this archetype. You may think you do, but if you look closely, you don't count for too much. See? The workaholic is another example. The shadow side of the magus is obvious. It's the person that has a lot of knowledge and uses it to manipulate and not to liberate. And there are a lot of people today who operate on this dark side of the magician. This is the dark magician that is so popular in stories throughout our cultures. Madison Avenue practices black magic, literally, because it is the use of very sophisticated behavioral knowledge to manipulate people on all fronts. And there are many other expressions of this. And of course, in the practice of analysis, those of us who are concerned with responsible practice of analysis and psychotherapy, our concern with monitoring countertransference issues focuses clearly right on this archetypal structure and its shadow side. Because so much of destructive countertransference in psychotherapy issues from an inability to be aware of the power drive, unconscious power drives of the therapist. If you haven't read Guggenbuhl-Craig's Power in the Helping Professions, it's a good place to look at for that. And of course, the shadow side of the lover is also obvious in the masculine expression in Don Juanism. One thing about the archetypal lover, whether masculine or feminine, is always promiscuous. And it is not so the way a lot of people think. It's like a lot of people, for example, talk a lot about infatuation. And they don't believe that when somebody falls in love, that there's really anything real happening. From my study of this particular archetypal structure and potential, I've decided that's not true. When this thing is constellated and has got too much of a hold on you, you really are loving. And you really are appreciating. You read the chapter that Bolin wrote on Aphrodite. Aphrodite really does love all these men. She loves this one now, and she relishes him, and she takes delight in him, eats him up. And then she notices this one, and she loves him too. And it is a true appreciative consciousness. There is a real aspect of archetypal loving in this. You see, that's what we've got to understand, and that's what the importance of looking at this archetypal structure will help us do. It is there to help us appreciate. If it is possessing us, we just appreciate all over the place, see? In an acting out mode. So one of the things you might say is that anyone who is acting out in a promiscuous manner is very much in touch with this archetypal structure, but that it is too much for their ego. Their ego simply cannot balance this in the context of their personality functioning. Now, so I'm out of time. I've got to stop and let us have a break. Let me just say clearly, when you're working with these archetypal images and potentials in the psyche, you've got two kinds of problems. One is achieving what Jungians always talk about as the ego-self axis, or the appropriate connection, the appropriate accessing without being possessed of this numinous energy. So that's one problem. The shadow expressions of this are subtle, and they manifest either if you're too far away from the potential and you project it on others and experience it vicariously, or if you're possessed by it. So you have negative pathological expressions of them in both of those ways. The other perennial problem in these archetypal structures in the psyche, Bolin has pointed out with regard to feminine pattern, is what I've called the imperialism of the archetypes. An archetypal pattern wants all of you. They say that gods and goddesses are jealous. That's has psychological meaning. It means that each of these patterns wants everything. And if you're a workaholic, you know something about that. The inner warrior wants all of you, 101% of you. It doesn't want any other competition. So the problem you have not only is accessing these things, but in finding some way to mediate between them through your ego development so that you can individuate, become a person who can access all of these things appropriately as you live out your embodied existence as a person and not an archetype. I've got to stop there. We'll take a break of about 15 minutes or so, 20, and then come back. Thank you very much. So let's just open it up and have the courage to be imperfect and stick your hand up and ask questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you give us some examples of what you think are the best new and things going on as far as ritual practice and men?
Yeah.
Around the country.
I don't think there's too much really positive going on for men around the country in terms of ritual process. There's a lot for women. Let me tell you about some things that are happening that are attempts to deal with some of this. Please restrain your temptation to laugh now on this. You've probably heard of the groups of men that are going out and dressing up in fatigues, combat fatigues, and everything, and getting these little paint guns, and they're playing war for a weekend out in the forest, jungles of deepest Iowa. Well, it's tempting really to joke and make fun of that and totally miss its significance. It is funny, of course, but with you, human beings are funny about something. They tend to intuit a lot of things long before they have the slightest grasp about what it's all about. And what I'm convinced is that a lot of these men are sensing that they are very, very out of touch with this archetype of the warrior. And they have some vague sense that what they need is not really to go out and kill people. They have the sense, maybe I don't have to invade Nicaragua. Think about that a minute. Think about the implications of the uninitiated male and political policy. But these people that we're talking about are not going off to invade Nicaragua. They're not reading necessarily Sojourn Fortune magazine, although the readership of Sojourn Fortune magazine is directly related to this phenomenon. See? But they're realizing that they are very much out of touch with this thing within them that they need somehow to embody, somehow to ritualize, somehow to get in touch with. And while it is play in the deepest sense of homo ludens. It's play in the deepest sense of liminoid phenomena, as Victor Turner talked about it. That is, there's a depth dimension to this play. It's very serious. It is a empowering kind of play for these men. Now, I haven't seen any research on this phenomena, but I'll bet there will be some. But I doubt seriously, from a clinical point of view, I doubt seriously that you're having any great transformation of the masculine through these experiences. But that's an empirical question. It's not inconceivable that some men might come away from experiences like that if they were well run in terms of somebody knowing what they were doing, that they might come away feeling more in touch with those energies within themselves, and they might return to their work or their creative projects with much more capacity to get themselves together and to function in a focused and disciplined way. But that kind of thing, these people will not even see that as ritual process. Clearly it is. Clearly it's a ritual process, but it's not talked about as such. And I think that it's going to be like so many other things in the sexual revolution. Men are going to be a lot slower in picking up on the need for ritualization than women have been. And as I say, a lot of creative things now are being done among feminist leaders and a number of fields with regard to ritualization. The increasing popularity of neo-paganism in general as a religious phenomenon, and Wicca, the religion of the goddess in particular, is directly related to its more adequate sensitivity to ritual process than a lot of traditional religions. But for masculinity, it's going to be a while, I'm afraid. The kind of work I do with active imagination in these workshops, active imagination with these archetypes, is a ritual process with the masculine. And I have done these workshops around a number of places in the country, and I encourage therapists there to pick this stuff up and do it. And so that is being done now, and I suspect that it will be done more widely as people understand more about the ritual role of active imagination with some of these structures. But we're just beginning on that. Other comments and questions? Yes. Any physical culture in which you're in training is an embodiment of this kind of archetypal structure. If somebody's in touch with the archetype of the warrior, they are not flabby, period. Male or female. If they're really, really accessing this thing, they will have an interest in physical culture. They will have an interest in getting in shape. And there is, in fact, tomorrow we'll talk about that in some depth. Because you start thinking about, if you want to make a soldier, what do you do? And there are a lot of ritual processes that you do. And one of them is you make them do push-ups until they, can't see. Well, it's not just ritual humiliation, though it is that. It is the capacity to stand pain. You know that little shibboleth that you get in weightlifting rooms? No pain, no gain? That's the motto of the archetype of the warrior. No pain, no gain. And if you think about this in the context of your creative work, it is true there. No pain, no book. Next question. Yes.
Do you see any of these archetypes in terms of polarities, the warrior versus the magus?
The way that I see them operating is that, and we'll get into this as I say a lot tomorrow, they regulate very different kinds of things. The interplay that seems to me to be most key is the role of the lover archetype. If you got too much king and not enough of the others, we'll get into the expressions of that. But a king that is not so much the warrior will be destructive, not so much because he doesn't have enough warrior. He may be destructive because he doesn't have enough magus, but he will definitely be destructive if he's out of touch with the lover, because he will not be able to feel human in terms of his functioning. He won't be able to have any eros connections in his work. It's not really a polarity. They regulate each other, but it's not in a bipolar pattern. So I wouldn't call it a polarity. The polarity that you see, are the sort of balance that we've got to work on, and that it remains. We've got to figure out how the masculine and feminine counterparts operate together. And what we've got to do is to talk about what happens when the contrasexual structures in the male do not pattern with the contrasexual structures in the female, in the relationship. And we've got to think about all the ways in which this thing turns. Because, Jung talked a lot about the pleroma, but it's been hard clinically to think about what the heck that had to do with anything. Well, this is what it has to do with. When Jung talks about the pleroma, he's talking about fullness. And when he's talking about the fullness, he's talking about the fullness of the masculine and the fullness of the feminine in the self-structure, in the archetypal self-structure. Problem is, in our egos, we are not full on either front. And when you start trying to individuate, the question is, where am I flat and underinflated? Like a ball, a basketball, that's sort of not pumped up enough. And we're all flat in different places. We're flat in certain places on our masculine spectrum, and we're flat in certain places on our feminine spectrum. So the key kind of question that I want to see worked on is the way in which these things articulate, the female warrior and the male warrior. Appropriate relationships between them, and then the queen and the king. Okay, let me frame this in terms of something I hoped that I would have time to talk about, but I didn't. And that is that there are a number of influences on whether or not you're going to get initiated into a rather developed masculine. One of them is your culture and your ethnic group. See, culture, your culture in general, the religion that you're born into, the ethnic group, all this being mediated in the family system. Now, the ordinary place you get a lot of this stuff is in your family of origin system. And it is not impossible that it occur there. It's just that if it were occurring there, things wouldn't be such a mess, see, empirically. So, and if you think about this initiatory process of masculinity now, and you think about what is happening demographically in terms of the disappearance of the male from so many families now, and not just in minority communities, then you've got to be real concerned about how boys are going to learn about what it is to be men in any kind of constructive expression. And one comment I wanted to make was, if you look at gangs in Chicago, gang life, it is quite clear that gangs in Chicago and the prison system in Illinois function as important masculine initiation systems for large numbers of boys and young men. My concern is that they are providing what I would call pseudo-initiations. And you're getting a really warped expression of the masculine coming out of these gang structures and the prison structures which are run by them. But it's not impossible that these things happen, and we hope that families can do it, and that good relationships with contrasexual partners can help. But if you just look at the epidemiology, it doesn't look too good right now. One of the reasons why I think it's very important to work in a Jungian context, for this reason. Most psychologies do not even address the issue of deep masculine. They do not have any kind of conceptuality to even address the issue. Most of them do not have any place to turn for the healing of the masculine except cognitive therapeutic techniques or experiential therapeutic techniques of some kind, or working with transference, countertransference. For example, if I were a Freudian analyst, and I was working with somebody with a very wounded masculine, I would hope that the brilliance of my interpretations and the insightfulness into my own working through of my own issues with the masculine would enable me to model for this person in such a way and to relate to this person in such a way that that my relationship with this person, through the brilliance of my interpretation and management of the transference and countertransference, would heal it. I'm glad I'm not a Freudian, because I wouldn't work with many men that were very wounded if I were, see, in terms of their masculine. Because, you see, if you're a Jungian, you don't have this belief that there are no resources for the healing of the person except me and my brilliant interpretations. See, from a Jungian point of view, the psyche has a blueprint in it for healing that parallels the way in which the body heals when it's wounded. And that there is a deep structure that in me, if I got wounded in my family, and my masculine never filled out because of that, from a Jungian point of view, I can at least know that deep within me there is a blueprint that knows what a full masculine would be. Even though this analyst that I may be working with may not. I take great comfort in that when I'm working with people, because I hope that they can get more healed in their masculine than I am when they're working in analysis, because they can contact with the depths of their own archetypal self, which contains the fullness, the pleroma, of the masculine and the feminine. And so that's why the Jungian point of view offers so much more hope to people who are really badly wounded. You know, I do a lot of work with child abuse, child sexual abuse. And, you know, if you've been sexually abused as a child, you know, this is not just a garden variety wounding. You feel terribly damaged in your sexuality, regardless of what sex you are. And it is very, very encouraging to both therapist and the person in therapy to have a mutual commitment that there is a fully healed individual imaged in their deep structures. No matter what happened to them as a child, they can fill out. I take it that that is a powerful reason to recommend Jungian thought to this world at this time, particularly for this reason that John is talking about. Somebody else. All I'm saying there is that it's not enough just to get in touch with the wild man at the bottom of the lake. I mean, you know, there are a lot of wild men that are crazy as a loon, you know. And you know, that's just, you know, Bly is an artist, and he has an artist carte blanche for overstatement. The thing about it is that, and this is something we've all got to work on. In the early days of the Jungian movement, we talked a lot about archetypes, but we didn't really delineate many. And we really didn't elaborate the unique functions of each kind of pattern. And what we've got to do, and these are just 4 patterns that I have seen that are important, and I don't make any claims that they're by far the only ones, or even necessarily the most important ones. I don't know. We hadn't done enough research on it. But what we've got to do is to become much more nuanced. That is to say, it's one thing to say we got to get in touch, an axis developed between the ego and yourself, your archetypal self. Well, that's fine and dandy, but the truth of the matter is that you may be already possessed by one aspect of your archetypal self. And we've got to get subtle enough in our reflection on this to be able to look at you closely and tell what part of the archetypal self you got too much of, and what part of the archetypal self you're out of touch with. And therefore, look at the different images which represent different potentials within the larger archetypal self. So all I'm saying there is that Bly, as an artist, was calling men to get back in touch with this deep masculine, which, you know, is the archetypal masculine. And you got to remember that Iron Hans, when he's in the lake or the pond, may be a wild man, but when he is disenchanted, when he comes out of a state of enchantment, he is a king. He is the king. The king comes back when enchantment ends, yes. Well, see, the fundamentalist movement is so large, it has a lot of different expressions. Like, you're really talking about the Jerry Falwell kind of thing, the moral majority kind of stuff. He doesn't speak in tongues, I don't think. But he's, you know, you think about what he's organized at. If you think about Falwell, it's a combination of the king and the warrior. He's really kind of imaged of himself as sort of a general. And you think about it. And, you know, a lot of Judeo-Christian imagery, I mean, if you look at the God of the Old Testament, I mean, it's in that same, so, he, you know, if you're very real biblical, you're going to, you know, come up with a lot of that kind of, okay? And you see what's going on there. You get this hyper-masculine kind of organizations in both Judeo-Christian systems and in Islam. And then you get the return of the goddess in a compensatory move. And it is going to, think about the imperialism of the archetypes that I spoke of. You know, the rule is that archetypes are imperialistic, and masculine archetypes are imperialistic, and they will not move over easily for the return of the archetypal feminine. See? There's going to be enormous conflict. Götterdämmerung, War of the Gods. And the only thing that mediates that culturally and on the planet is the same thing that mediates it in a personality. And that's awareness. See? Understanding, the development of an understanding about what's going on here. It's very important for us today to get some sense about the necessity for a sophisticated approach to archetypal spirituality on the planet. It's the only way you're going to be able to mediate this kind of thing. And that's a tall order, and who knows if we're going to meet that challenge. But that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the imperialism of the hyper-masculine kind of things in that movement, and you're seeing the compensatory movement embodied in the return of the goddess. But what we need to understand is that the archetypal feminine is also imperialistic by virtue of simply being archetypal. And that you're not going to get an integration and a manifestation of what Jungians call the conjunctio without a development of consciousness and awareness. Well, see, that's just, you say that well, and that just shows how enormous this task is that's facing us now, see? Because that's precisely the task of the ego. See, as we individuate, we try to become a person. Archetypes are not personal. Archetypes are flat. They are two-dimensional. In fact, one of the reasons that I don't like using gods and goddesses as the only way to talk about the archetypal is that gods and goddesses are more complicated than archetypes. If you talk about, say, Zeus as an archetype, well, there are certain ways in which that's true, but Zeus is complicated. He's got a lot of different archetypes that he manifests. Certainly the lover is one of them. And that's confusing. Archetypes are two-dimensional, they're flat, they're impersonal, and they're imperialistic, and the poor ego, as it's trying to figure out where it is in terms of the pleroma, has got to figure out not only where it is with regard to its ego structure, whether you have a masculine ego or a feminine ego. You got to deal with all this contrasexual stuff. So that is the task of the ego, and that is our task in terms of public policy, trying to vision the kind of relationship between the sexes which would correspond in this world to the vision of the conjunctio. A balanced, full, archetypal couple. And it is an enormous task. And that's what we all sign on for when we try to work on individuation. Thank you very much. I've had a great time, and you've been great.